Welcome to this book celebration and reception for Bibliotactics. Library. So, Bibliotactics, Libraries and the Colonial Public in Vietnam by Cindy Anh Nguyen. Bibliotactics, as we know, is just published by University of California Press, and books will be available for purchase during the reception. But the manuscript is also published open access, so that means that it's free to download at the UC Press Luminos website if you feel so inclined. So my name is Evyn Lê Espiritu Gandhi. I'm an associate professor of Asian American Studies here at UCLA, and it's my absolute honor to MC today's events. So before sharing more about the book and explaining the format of today's presentation, I just want to start off with some quick thank yous. So first, many thanks to the Information Studies Colloquium, UCLA DataX for providing this space, and the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for hosting today's event. Thank you too to our co-sponsor, the Barbra Streisand Center for the Study of Women. And as always, much gratitude to the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, the traditional land caretakers of Tavongar, the Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. Gathered here today as guests, we pay our respects to Hanuk Vitam, the ancestors, Ahihi Rome, elders, and Ayun Hikem, our relatives, relations, past, present, and emerging. So today, we come together to celebrate the publication of Bibliotactics, Libraries and the Colonial Public in Vietnam, bridging the fields of Vietnamese history, colonial and post-colonial studies, and information studies, particularly histories of libraries and the organization of knowledge. Bibliotactics examines the history of the Central Library in Hanoi and Cochin China Library in Saigon. The book offers several important interventions. First, it spans the colonial and the post-colonial, tracing continuities and ruptures in the library's usage and meaning under both French colonialism, so 1858 to 1945, and also national division, 1945 to 1975. Second, its geographical scope spans north and south, charting regional differences under French bureaucratic rule and then post-colonial nation building. And importantly, provincializes Eurocentric histories of libraries from the perspective of Vietnam. Lastly, the book examines the Hanoi and Saigon libraries as both, quote, public infrastructure and social practices, so that's Cindy's words, examining how the institution shaped publics, which in turn reshaped the institution. So Dr. Ling argues that, quote, the library stood as a contradiction. On one hand, it was a symbolic opening or a world of ideas through universal education, access to modern knowledge, and shared public spaces. On the other hand, the claim of intellectual emancipation was predicated on French colonial paternalistic relationship of a centralized difference between colonizer and colonized. And that's from the introduction. Perhaps most exciting, the book offers the concept of bibliotactics, which, quote, advances a relational and multi-directional theory of power that blurs the arbitrary divide between rule makers and rule breakers, or the library personnel and patrons, end quote. So knowledge is power, but power is relational. The library, like the university, serves as a key site of this negotiation. 5 body chapters offer 5 bibliotactics of the colonial public. So to document, to be in public, to circulate, to read, and to reassemble. And you should definitely check out the amazing zine if you haven't done so already. So joining us today to discuss the book are 3 esteemed guests. And maybe you've been to other book talks, book celebrations. This will be a slightly different format. So I'm just going to explain what's going to happen and what's going to unfold so you have a sense. So these 3 guests have been invited to select a short passage from the book, read it out loud, and then offer some short commentary on their chosen passage. Given Bibliotactic's emphasis on readers and reading practice, the goal of this exercise is to flip the format of the traditional book talk and stage a collective reading. So please join me in welcoming Professors Claire Edington from UC San Diego, Nguyen Vo Thu Huong from UCLA Asian American Studies and Asian Languages and Cultures, and George Dutton from UCLA Asian Languages and Cultures. So let's give them a warm welcome. So before I call up Claire, I just want to give you an overview of our process. So following our guest reader's remarks, I'll invite our author, Dr. Cindy Anh Nguyen, to join us for a response. This will be followed by a short collective conversation amongst the author and the three guest readers before we open up the discussion to audience Q&A. And then we invite you to stay for the reception where you can enjoy Vietnamese food and music, purchase a copy of the book, and then ask Cindy to sign it. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to welcome up Claire. Thank you.
Imagine this. On a beautiful moonlit day with a pleasant breeze, a few close friends gather together, discussing a few lines from literature, and together they relish in more and more joyfulness. Or, alone in the evening hours, under the light, a book becomes our friend, and any sadness we carry dissipates. This quote from 1924 appears in chapter 4 of Bibliotactics. It describes reading as a quiet, even tender act, one that can transport us and even transform our mood. It is also a space for creating joy through togetherness, for learning through shared reflection, for cultivating a discerning taste and a refined mind, and also as a place for imagining different futures collectively. So it is contemplating reading as a collective act that I'd like to discuss for the short time I have here today, but let me first just say a few words about Cindy's book. Bibliotactics is a cultural and political history of the library in Vietnam, breaking new ground in the field of information and library studies, the history of the book, Southeast Asian studies, and the history of empire. In this book, Cindy explores the colonial library from every angle, as an element of the built environment that promises a new kind of space of urban sociability and intellectual exchange, as a space where reading works in translation as well as those by homegrown authors, as a site of surveillance by the colonial state, and as a site of subversion by Vietnamese readers eager to cultivate their own aesthetics and politics. And in particular, she argues that the library was a significant site for an emergent colonial public sphere whose contours were continuously being debated and tested, especially as the act of reading itself became cast as a cosmopolitan, modern, and even political act. Now, what is so clever about this project is how it takes what has otherwise been taken for granted in the historical scholarship of Vietnam during this period, that people in fact were reading, and interrogates not just what they were reading, but where and how and with whom. This project spatializes the dissemination and consumption of texts, both within and beyond the institution of the library, and tracks its evolution across the political turbulence of the colonial and post-colonial periods. Now, what I particularly loved about reading chapter 4 is its attention to how Vietnamese during the late colonial period recognized the power that comes with reading together, whether in community libraries and reading rooms, mutual aid societies, or literary associations. These spaces help to proliferate new meanings of who counts as the reading public by promoting literacy to create new audiences of Vietnamese readers of Vietnamese texts, and by considering new technologies and their social possibilities. For example, the audiobook. Cindy describes a 1929 article entitled, quote, "Reading books but not actually reading them. Whom does this benefit? Whom does this harm?" The author talks about the emergence of the audiobook in the United States, explaining, quote, "We are now living in a time of machine technology." The fact that Vietnam has a well-established oral tradition of collective listening made the local uptake of this globally circulating technology promising. At the same time, the author warns against the possible risks, arguing, quote, that listening to audiobooks would still require a lot of time, and that listeners may not remember what they heard as much as what they read with their eyes. So take what we all say with a grain of salt and actually go and read the book yourself. This idea of reading with one's eyes and ears helps me to think about reading as an effective, even multi-sensorial experience. As Cindy so generally points to in the book, reading goes beyond absorbing words on a page. It is also about discussing text together in a shared space in ways that resist atomization and that creates new communities outside of the kind of exclusive elitism of the Hanoi and Saigon Central libraries. And of course, this passage made me think too about our current technological moment and political predicament and what it means for being able to do this kind of work at all. So I wanted to end by sharing a reflection from the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Percival Everett, who in a recent interview described libraries as the, quote, seat of subversion. He continues, quote, "Reading is the most subversive thing we can do in any culture. The second most subversive thing is not writing, The second most subversive thing is being part of a book club. When we read, we become critical, we are open to ideas, we think. And that's what fascists do not want us to do. Language is our place of safety. Language is what keeps us free. And if we can't communicate with each other, if we can't impart ideas, then we might as well give up. I was struck by how well this quote applied to the world Cindy describes in Bibliotactics as it does to our world today. Congrats, Cindy, on this remarkable achievement. I'm so proud of you.
And I'll invite Nguyen Vo Thu Huong.
Well, thank you for having me here today. I'm going to read from chapter 5, the opening of chapter 5. The title of the chapter is To Reassemble the Decolonization of Libraries. So this chapter traces the transformations taking place around the First Indochina War of 1946 to 1954, with libraries in territory controlled by the Democratic Republic, which later controlled North Vietnam, and in the various incarnations of the state of Vietnam as the kernel for the later Republic of Vietnam in the South. So these two passages are going to talk a little bit about the library in Hanoi and then in Saigon. Okay. It was the fall of 1945 in Hanoi. The celebratory flags of the Independence Declaration of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or the DRV, on September 2nd remained. Yet the crowds had dispersed and the new government had begun their work. Outside the Hanoi Central Library, the sign reading Bibliotactic de Pierre Bastier had been replaced with one reading Quốc gia Thư viện. Inside the building, library administrators continued to issue reading cards, process book returns, and requests from readers, and log daily operations. All government offices, including the new Ministry of National Education, Bộ Quốc gia Giáo dục, under the Hanoi Central Library was now organized, or requires to standardize their administrative language and paperwork, switching from French to Quốc ngữ, Vietnamese, the Vietnamese script. The Hanoi Archives and Library submitted a list of specialized technical words in French with Vietnamese translations and simple explanations of administrative operations. Although colloquially, these spaces were already referred to by their Vietnamese names, the salle de lecture, or reading room, was now officially phòng đọc sách, and the section de prêt, lending section, was now the phòng mượn sách. Indochina-wide policies bearing the colonial title Indochine were now transitioned to a national designation. The Indochina legal deposit regime, Régie du dépôt légal de l'Indochine, was now Sở Lưu trú Văn hóa phẩm toàn quốc, Department of Nationwide Deposit of Cultural Products. The translation of colonial Hanoi Library into a national Vietnamese library was the first symbolic action to rupture its institutional lineage and organization from its French colonial past. It was the fall of 1945 in Saigon, and the city was still reeling from the chaos and violence that took place after the radio broadcast of the Independence Declaration from Hanoi. Throughout September and October, Allied forces arrived in southern Vietnam to disarm the Japanese, attack the fledgling DRV administrative base in Saigon, and assisted French troops in retaking the former colony of Cochin China. In June 1946, a few months after the departure of Allied forces, the French High Commissioner and a handful of Vietnamese politicians established the provisional government of the Republic of Cochin China, a semi-autonomous state in southern Vietnam that was separate from the northern-based DRV. The High Commission signaled Vietnamese semi-autonomy by transferring the Saigon Cochin China Library to the provisional Vietnamese government on June 28, 1946. The library appears to be one of the first institutions to be transferred and thus served as an important symbol of the eventual transition of all of colonial institutions in former Cochin China into a different post-colonial configuration. The library was placed within the Service of Education for Southern Vietnam and renamed the National Library of Southern Vietnam, Thư viện Quốc gia Việt Nam, Thư viện Quốc gia Nam Việt. Even with the renaming, Vietnamese librarians and readers often refer to the library by its various names, including the old colonial name, Cochin China Library, or Thư viện Nam Kỳ. Colloquial names such as the Saigon Library, Thư viện Saigon, and the administrative name, the Library of the Southern Region, Thư viện Nam Phan, or the Library of Southern Vietnam, Thư viện Nam Phan, Vietnam. So you can sort of like see the confusion of different names just to refer to the territory in southern Vietnam because sovereignty was in dispute in this period. So I'm going to continue after that opening to the chapter with the last paragraph of the chapter so that you can see how the setup of the changes with these libraries in North Vietnam and in Northern Vietnam and in Southern Vietnam eventually turned into sort of like statecraft and being part of the power negotiation of nation building to prepare for the post-colonial period, so this transitional period from colonialism to some form of a post-colonial nation. So this is from the conclusion of chapter 5. By 1955, the Colonial Information Order of former Indochina, the libraries, archives, legal deposit, and directorate office was fragmented and reassembled in the distinct nation states of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, Kingdom of Laos, and Kingdom of Cambodia. The former colonial libraries turned national institutions inherited and made sense of their colonial heritage, grappling with the legacies of the French colonial library. The colonial infrastructure, such as buildings and concentration in urban centers, the collections dominated by French language sources, the library operations based on French library sciences, the limited public use of the libraries that privileged urban francophone reader elites, and a colonial mission of libraries that functioned as the instruments of French modernization and cultural propaganda. Throughout the periods of regime transitions and political conflict, from 1945 to 1954, Vietnamese librarians of the Hanoi and Saigon institutions undertook extensive campaigns to reevaluate collections and procedures and to translate terminologies and train personnel. Part of this process was a critical evaluation of the inequality and failures of the colonial library and the envisioning of a Vietnamese national library with a distinctly post-colonial mission. Within the constraints of French recolonization efforts, many of these visions of a post-colonial Vietnamese library took the shape of operational grafting and tentative reassemblage. Yet by 1955, two distinct Vietnamese nation states with national capitals in Hanoi and Saigon were competing for Vietnamese cultural and political authority. In these two national capitals were two national libraries that confronted their colonial legacies and reimagined a post-colonial Vietnamese national library that truly served the Vietnamese nation and public. So instead of trying to give more commentaries on your particular argument in the book, which I think is absolutely brilliant, and again, thank you for letting me engage with it, I thought I would talk about how what you talk about in this chapter sort of like have a significance for me in this particular moment that we live in. So I was very much struck by this issue of language that you bring up, right? A lot of the descriptions in chapter 4 and in chapter 5 were about the transitioning from like French language materials into like Vietnamese language materials, either the translation of that material or the inclusion of Vietnamese language media in periodicals, which were many during this period, and novels, and other types of texts, and how that was so fundamental to the formation or the rise of a particular form of nationalism that eventually turned into anti-colonial nationalism with significant impacts in terms of how the subsequent post-colonial states of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and the Republic of Vietnam in the south eventually became. And so, I was thinking about this issue of language, but in our context, in terms of like the Vietnamese American community or the Vietnamese refugee diaspora, and the complex ways in which language function in relation to nationalism, in relation to issues of sovereignty, in relation to issues of belonging, right? So in the community, there has been a kind of rise in the tension around the Vietnamese language, the use of the Vietnamese language. Some of the youth activists who work in the community feel like they are being shut out because they do not have full access to the Vietnamese language. And of course, that is a function of this kind of, racist assimilationist structure in the US where you have to lose, whatever language you came with very quickly in order to be whitened a little bit so that you can function in white spaces in the US, right? So we have this sort of like this conflict that's been going on for a while. And then we had the entrance of Viet language materials that were alt-right, MAGA oriented. A lot of it was disseminated by the Falun Gong group that printed a lot of materials in Vietnamese, right, in the Vietnamese language. And who in the community still reads the Vietnamese language is usually the working class folks in the community or younger folks who just came as recent immigrants from Vietnam and then the older generation of refugees. So those folks still read Vietnamese and write Vietnamese as the main language, right? And so then we have this sort of appropriation of the Vietnamese language for white nationalism as opposed to just Vietnamese nationalism. Of course, there is a Vietnamese nationalist component to the language of dissemination of the Vietnamese language because of the rise of Chinese expansionism in the Southeast Asian region, and therefore the rise of Vietnamese territorial nationalism in Vietnam as well. And because the Vietnamese language became the common language for folks in the community and folks in Vietnam, it became a conduit for the rise of Vietnamese territorial nationalism. So there's all of these different mosaic pieces that sort of came together very differently from a language that functioned as a tool of anti-colonialism, right, in the early decades of the 20th century, all the way through the mid-20th century and beyond. And this is how it has, sort of play a very different kind of function. Now in this particular moment, adding to the kind of polarization and tension, class division, age division within, generational division within the Vietnamese community, with, in terms of how this language of legacy nationalism became, something else. Not entirely losing its nationalist, Vietnamese nationalist credentials, but definitely it has become a kind of language of white nationalism in the Vietnamese community, which is such a twist and turn, right? And so I was thinking about how, that language, sovereignty, nationalism, and belonging, how they work in these very complex, paradoxical ways, depending on a particular historical moment, which brings me to the second thing in your book that really spoke to me, particularly in chapter 4 and 5, where you take an approach that shows the complex and kaleidoscopic formations in the range of responses to colonialism, which you call reassemblage. In chapter 5, you showed the reactions and grafting in the moment rather than an abrupt shift from colonial to decolonial or post-colonial. So this approach not only enables us to see these complexities on the ground, but also opens us up to nuanced possibilities of how to engage with national languages in specific contexts. This, I think, is the gift that you give us in this particular fraught moment when you infuse history into ahistorical conversations about decolonization, while we must contend with the deepening of this vicious fascism that we're living with right now in this moment. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And now I'll invite Misha.
I'm very happy to be here and two very tough acts to follow, so I'm not sure how my comments will compare, but I want to start with just a few, thanks for the reminder, a few sort of general personal comments, because reading Cindy's book was a trip down memory lane for me. As a historian, traveling to Vietnam is about visiting libraries, it's about visiting bookstores, it's about collecting as many books as I could possibly carry with me or put into the oversized suitcase I would purchase specifically for that purpose. I have very fond memories of working in the National Library in Hanoi, the Social Sciences Library in Saigon, strong memories of visiting pretty much every bookstore in Vietnam, between the largest branches of Bahasa to the tiniest little hole-in-the-wall used bookstore. Now as I go to Vietnam, I see the diminution of the number of both used and new bookstores. It's definitely something that troubles me. And I also have very strong early memories of visiting Vietnam in 1990 and seeing every Ciclo driver perched on the back of their Ciclo waiting for a ride, and they were reading a novel or a newspaper or a magazine. These days, of course, Ciclos have become tourist props, and most of those people have a cell phone propped in their hand, but the memory still lingers for me. Also on a personal level, reading about these libraries and the kind of library world brought back memories of my own work in libraries. For example, I loved reading about the bibliobus, something I didn't know about, because after I finished my first year of college, I actually spent a summer working as a clerk in a bookmobile in the Carnegie Library System in Pittsburgh. And so I firsthand experienced the kind of joy that a mobile library can bring to underserved communities, where people come, the weekly scheduled stop for that library bus to be able to collect the books that they're looking for. I also spent a year working as a page in Brown University John Hay Library, which Cindy, I'm sure, knows from her time at Brown, where I also saw the joys of working in a library space, of being surrounded by books and that kind of smell of books as well. And I think because libraries have thus become a foundational part of my life, it's probably why if you come to my house today, you'll see a little free library at the bottom of my stairs, where I've got a whole stock of banned books that I'm trying to push out into the world, because I so believe in the mission of libraries and what they can represent for communities. But what I really want to do today, sort of getting to Cindy's book, is to engage with the materials a little bit. In particular, I was drawn to the chapter 4 on reading, because I'm really interested in readers and the kinds of materials that people read. And I will also say, too, that in kind of echoing my colleagues' attempts to connect this work to the present moment, I think we're at a moment in American history, certainly, where libraries have never mattered more, but have never also been under more pressure and under more stress by communities seeking to ban and restrict access to libraries and to books. And these, of course, affect readers very profoundly, as much as they do libraries and authors and publishers. And so I'm very interested in this kind of question of gatekeeping, who controls what it is that people are able to read. And so let me just read a portion from chapter 4. This is under the subheading, Reading as Moralization of Women, Youth, in the Countryside. Often the cultivation of bookish leisure and aesthetic techniques of reading were framed against a moralized critique of uncurbed social ills and naive reading tastes. The moralized concerns were directed toward an amorphous group of those in need of guidance, specifically women, youth, and rural villagers. In their paternalistic representations, urban and primarily male intellectuals constructed caricatures of these demographics as naive, subject to politically dangerous ideas, and easily addicted to the temptations of modern life. Many male writers took multiple pseudonyms, sometimes taking on female names, to publicly comment on changing gender norms and female behavior. In the popular commentary section of Ha Tang No Bao on February 13, 1930, an author with the female name of Pham Thi Lan Kang argued that female readers love to read harmful novels and lack the intellectual capacity to discern between good and bad books. Other articles claim that reading good novels has the potential to broaden one's intelligence in order to follow the road of civilization, bringing happiness to the family and the country. Yet the article also reported that many women were dedicating their time to reading the recent popular wave of sensationalist and morally depraved literature. The authors expressed concern about female readers pouring their hearts and minds into reading novels and incessantly gossiping about fictional and romantic storylines. By reading a lot of novels but not reading with discretion, the brains of women are filled with images of crumbling society from the stories. It doesn't take long until the women become accustomed to this, and their personality also changes to mimic those stories, and no medicine can save them. Right? So this idea that the dangers of certain kinds of reading might be a menace to particular segments of the population understood to be perhaps more vulnerable or susceptible to these ideas, I think raises really interesting questions about the gatekeeping processes that can be in place, the kinds of books that should be made available in libraries, the kinds of books that people should actually be reading. And it suggests, of course, a sense of the power of books, that it can have these effects on people, that it can change how they think, how they feel, how they respond to particular circumstances. Now, of course, in Vietnamese history, the French colonial period was hardly the first time in which Vietnamese tried to control what the public read. Earlier regimes had lists of proscribed books, certain topics that could not be published, heterodox interpretations of the past that were made illegal, that were prohibited. The lay rulers sought out and destroyed books they considered to be heterodox. The Nguyen rulers hunted down and tried to suppress texts related to their predecessors, the Tay Son regime, partly out of revenge and partly, of course, to control narrations of the past. In Bibliotactics, we see, Cindy talks about the kinds of techniques and devices that were used to control, regulate, gatekeep in a fashion the kinds of materials that were being consumed by the reading public. These control mechanisms were perhaps less overt than might have been the case in prior eras, perhaps not aggressive attempts to eliminate from circulation certain kinds of books, but certainly a kind of curation that prioritizes certain kinds of titles, that prioritizes to shape what readers see and perhaps the kinds of peoples that they become. I'd say there were two kinds of gatekeeping that were going on, both by French colonial officials who controlled the kinds of books that came into collections, the certain kind of collection priorities, and then Vietnamese intellectuals, mostly men, as Cindy points out, and as I guess we could probably imagine being the case, who had very distinct opinions on the kinds of books that Vietnamese should be reading and the kinds that were perhaps better left untouched, unopened for fear of the consequences that they might have. And so, I think it's really important to recognize again, especially in the present moment, this idea of trying to control what people read because of a fear that books have a power that might cause people to become something that might be undesirable. And so the book banning we see in this country, for example, in the present moment, is very much concerned with the effects that books have on the minds of, in this case, not women, but younger readers, children, young adults, people in school libraries who may have access to books which are considered to perhaps be dangerous because they expose people to realities about LGBTQ community, about the experience of immigrants, of people of color, of the challenges of trying to navigate one's identity in various sorts of ways. And so I think as Cindy's book makes clear, it's really important to understand that this idea of trying to control what people read is certainly something that has passed through history in an ongoing kind of a way. A recognition, I think, ultimately, that books are very powerful and the effects they have on us are certainly worth bearing in mind. But I think at the end of the day also sort of recognizing, as I think Cindy's book does as well, that the important thing is to put as many books of every imaginable kind into the hands of every reader who wants access to those books to be able to chart their own course. Because I think, as you mentioned in the beginning, Claire, right, I mean, the thing that's most important is that reading books is, maybe that was you, Evyn, sorry, is perhaps the most subversive thing that one can do, right? An act of reading is a powerful political act, and I think Cindy's book more than makes that clear. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you so much to our three guest readers. Let's give them one more thank you. All right, so now for the moment that many of us have been waiting for, we are going to introduce our esteemed guest. Let's give her another round of applause. All right, so I'm going to read her formal bio so that we can welcome her to the stage. So Dr. Cindy Anh Nguyen is an assistant professor of the University of California, Los Angeles, with appointments in Information Studies, Digital Humanities Program, and Asian Languages and Culture. Her first book, Bibliotactics, speaks to her ability to weave the fields of information, history, and cultural studies together. Her transdisciplinary research examines the historical and socio-technical production of knowledge in Southeast Asia through libraries, encyclopedia, visual media, and language through feminist, decolonial, and critical approaches. Her multidimensional research has been recognized by the Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, American Libraries Association, Society for the History of Authorship, Reading and Publishing, and National Endowment for the Humanities. Through DataX, she is the convener of the Critical Data Lab that explores Global South cultural heritage through community-driven digital humanities design. She is also a public scholar and community artist. And just on a personal note, I want to say that Cindy is a dear friend and colleague. We met at UC Berkeley when we were both graduate students. So I feel like I was there when this project germinated and was born. And so I'm just so happy and proud to be with you here with you today and to celebrate the culmination of so many years of hard work. So congratulations, Cindy.
All right. So I think I'm supposed to talk about this book. But really, I just want to talk about the people that brought me to this place. So this collective writing and this journey of bibliotactics was really defined through kinship and lifelong learning. Now with the privilege of celebrating this book with my communities, my man, my ba, Amma, and Eric and Tiana, who I think are outside, probably hear me somehow. My students, colleagues, and friends here in a time of chaos and violence, I hold even more dearly this moment of gathering. So I honestly confess that I ran out of words to say trying to finish this book, so I'll do my best with the words I still have in me to share more about what it means to write what is not simply an academic book about libraries. So the book had one set of beginnings here at UCLA 20 years ago. Yes, you can go ahead and do the math. I was an undergrad studying history and found myself in Southeast Asian studies and taking classes with some of the professors who are seated here in this round table, with an unnamed professor who gave me an A-. And I continued on in this journey. But during those younger years, I visited Vietnam for the first time since my parents had fled as refugees by boat, and then I also returned to Malaysia, where I had been born in a refugee camp. I didn't know I was going to be a historian, but I only knew that narrative mattered. To make sense of the historical context that brought my family to the States, to piece together what's going on now, here, and in the world. So I have other sets of beginnings to this book. The after-school visits to the local public library as a child, and the privilege to travel through worlds and dreams through reading. Befriending librarians, archivists, and digital humanists along the way who opened my mind towards the practices of information, collecting, preserving, access, and community. And then I also have the beginnings that were also the endings for me to finish the book. Claire and Evyn ushering this book through the final stages. And many of you who are here, I forgot to shout out to Anna and Gabe, who actually witnessed and knew far too long, and Kevin, how long I have been working on this book. So this includes my parents and my mother-in-law, who are still shocked that today's book celebration is still the same book and not like my third or fourth book that I was able to create. But it's the same, yeah, it's the same book. The birth of Hianan and my family life with Eric, who are the ultimate distractions and also reasons to get work done. joining my information studies department and digital humanities program here at UCLA a little over 2 years ago, a beginning that deeply informed the last stages of the book, where library histories were not just past abstractions and theory, but were commitments to contemporary practice and social political transformation. And I'll conclude with a moment that defined the book to be in the form it is here today. So I realized somewhat late in my academic life in writing this book that I actually come from at least 2 generations of those without formal learning. Rather than as a literary and intellectual family, our concerns growing up were really about survival, about community and connection. So this positionality informed how I first understood and wrote about Vietnamese reading culture and library history, firstly as an outsider. So I wrote about library history as one of power, of privilege, of hierarchy, of patriarchy. And all of those elements are woven into the book when discussing the racial hierarchies, the elitism, the gendered and paternalistic dimensions of reading and library access within the hegemonic constraints of French colonialism as well as nation-state efforts. And then through realization of that, I come from multiple generations of those without formal lettered learning, I shifted the framing that my book too was about everything around the book. The people, the social interactions, the misreadings and defiance, the space, the visions, the dreams, and the cultural identity associated with building collections. The agency that individuals possess even within structures of inequality. So the question that guided me then and continues today is, who is this library intended for? Who gives a library, an institution, meaning?
Thank you so much, Cindy. It's so lovely to hear more about the thought process and the journey behind the book, and all of the people and ancestors that you're bringing into this room with us as well. So now I just want to open it up for a quick roundtable discussion amongst the 4 of you that I will sort of moderate. But maybe I just want to open up if there's anything that folks want to respond to in regards to each other. A common thing that came up is, this is ostensibly a historical text, but the resonances of a lot of your arguments and insights are still resonating today in regards to the power of reading, the power of language, Vietnamese language, and how it has shifted over time and how it resonates now in the contemporary moment. So maybe I'd just like to open it up, or if there's anything specifically, Cindy, you'd like to respond to.
I see Claire looking.
Well, no, I just to pick up on that, how much were these contemporary questions weighing on you as you were writing it, or did it just kind of come out organically that you could trace these connections afterwards?
I think they were always there, particularly during the field research. So the contemporary questions, even what George brought up about the transition to mobile reading. And I remember actually when I would tell Vietnamese folks in Vietnam when I was I'm working on this project about reading, and then they would be like, did you hear that statistic that Vietnamese only read 1 book a year? And then it was introduced to me quite overtly or very obviously, where they were just why are you writing a book about libraries where clearly it doesn't matter to the population? But it raised all these questions about contemporary reading practices in Vietnam, transition to digital technology, but also why those statistics matter, actually, because a lot of the statistics collecting came out of USAID, UN efforts to measure reading as a reflection of, this has happened throughout time, but measure reading as a reflection of development. So these statistics were very weighing on, and it had this national shame that was used in the context of Vietnam, but also, Vietnamese are very tongue-in-cheek, so they use it humorously. So that was the Vietnam historical side. And then the contemporary reflections and even a lot of the framing of the book that happened in the last, I would say, 2 years came as a reflection of being here at UCLA, teaching Master's Library and Information Science students and with my colleagues in information, and being in this privileged position to not be siloed in my thoughts and in the historical past, thinking really about connections across region and into contemporary context. So I find that it would have been a different book if I wasn't here, truly.
I'll just pick up on that. I mean, can you say a little bit more about the information studies kind of angle? I mean, I think it's very clear in the introduction of how questions around the organization of knowledge, who gets to organize that knowledge, and how do we interact and engage with those structures are clear in the book. But I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how, because your PhD, right, is not in information studies. So to what degree were you already engaging with those fields before you came to UCLA? And maybe what are some new insights that some conversations here have brought to the book?
Yeah, so I think one of my fields was from science and technology studies, and I looked through historical organization of knowledge and classification. So a lot of that was in one of my fields from a historical perspective. And I think the praxis orientation was, to Claire's question about implications today, was drawn from my librarian practitioner students and friends and colleagues here. Yet I think the information studies framing deeply around infrastructure and labor really transformed the book and creating it in the shape it is. So what that looks like is with attention to libraries as this debated, evolving institution of various different actors and then their relationships to them. So that really, the information side as well as my colonial, post-colonial studies side really reshaped the approach of bibliotactics as a relational and situated understanding of power. So relational in that we're thinking about different hierarchies from a colonial, post-colonial side of the relationships between the primarily Vietnamese male readers to the head director who was a French male, to kind of the middle tier workers who were primarily Vietnamese male, to the female French readers. So kind of thinking about relationality in that sense. And then situatedness, thinking about what are they doing from the librarian labor side? What are they tasked to do from technical and task-oriented, what are their tasks? Collecting records, preservation, for what end? So it was this meticulous attention to these processes that I think information and history of technology approaches gave me grounding for. I guess the other thought too about weaving, information studies, those who are in the department is such a field that brings in material, bibliographic, attention to space, as well as questions of labor, to questions of information access, and so there's all these layers to it, which I think is why my book is informed by so many of those layers. But the other side from kind of information as a field was drawing deeply from histories of reading and book culture, and just thinking about so much of both the information field as well as book history and history of print culture is from a Western perspective. It's very Western and Anglophone, dominated in that side. And what we have then is this, not only this asymmetry in terms of different types of reading cultures, but then it's this kind of assumption of models being a bit static and then kind of exported into different contexts. So I think in a way, by dialogue with me as a historian and grounded in Vietnamese study, it also really fed into the book history revision and decentering, because I was looking deeply at Vietnamese practices, questions of language, questions of what people are reading, situating Vietnamese and Francophone reading practices in the longer history of Vietnam, because of Vietnam's longer literary history. So I think that texture really also is shifting how I contribute on the flip side, like how does Viet Studies contribute into the information side?
Other questions that you have for the guest readers? I guess maybe were you surprised by the passages that they selected? This is perhaps one of the first public engagements with readers of your book.
I mean, and also the backstory is like, this is like a dream design as an author, to just be like, I get to hear readers, which as you can tell from the book is like what I pursue as an intellectual pursuit. So there's this meta level as me as an academic author, I get to hear readers. So yeah, so I appreciate that space. I think that's something that surprised me. Also in Thu Huong's comments, I was like, there's another book here. Like drawing those articulations across like forms of language and language nationalism across time and space. I really just appreciated that story, and I think what it speaks to is one of like the intentional designs I have in the book, where there are different forms of valorization about power, right? So there is a story about anti-colonial resistance, and there's a valorization of that form of collective identity and the post-colonial state that takes it has this benevolence to it. And I really like, through taking seriously processes of decolonization, not as like an end event, but really drawing a lot from all the decolonial work in terms of like Patrick Wolf, not thinking about these as events, but as processes, and then pulling in the more tedious work of tracing infrastructure, tracing renaming, all of those processes. This is how decolonization looks like in practice, right? And then that labor that informs decolonization is not just, it's debated. It's not, and sometimes it's like, comes second. It's within the constraints of like human necessity at times, and then also in the context of war, there's like different types of priorities that happen. So then kind of the narrative that's associated with the anti-colonial national state comes after the fact, but in the moment, what's happening. So I really appreciate your attention to that process of reassemblage in chapter 5. And then drawing the deep connections with the Vietnamese American community now. A few of us here are involved in different curricular activities in terms of building the Vietnamese American refugee curricula. So that's what I was thinking about too. And then what it means to write Vietnamese refugee history, but also situate Vietnamese refugee history in the longer history of Vietnam. And then having that material, that curriculum accessible in English and in Vietnamese, and who's reading them. So it really made me think about the importance of the translation, not just as language, but thinking deeply about those communities that are using those languages. So I thank you so much for that.
Oh, yeah, I was just blown away. Just the tracing, I don't know how you do it, like tracing of like all of these different entities that keep changing their names. That must have been like, quite a labor of love.
It wasn't lovely. Anyway, I think in part I was sense making too, and sitting with like, in the archival documents in terms of like, what happened here and why are there so many reports, and then tracing the kind of more residual, because you see like cross outs and like the letterhead, like is this happening too? Some of the tedious, the slowness I took with that, some of it was by intention, and some of it was just because of the structure of life in Vietnam during the archival work. Just like took sometimes a lot of time for me to retrieve the documents. So I was just like sitting and staring at these reports and sense making that. Yeah, I think I told Claire this too, but all the chapters I'm proud of for different reasons. That decolonization chapter, I was very just intentional in pushing against, the Vietnamese studies is often, books end in 1945, the Declaration of Independence, or in 1954, the end of the First Indochina War, and I really wanted to trouble that, and to do it through like tracing the library and following it through in terms of moving the collection. So I guess that's also the information side, the material side of tracing collections, and what kind of narrative that can pull out when we're not taking the nation state as the definitive narrative. I see Claire and maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you're talking and as I'm thinking about this, I mean, I think one of the things really interesting too is this is a kind of interesting new way to look at the colonial era, right? Obviously through a very different lens, but it's also useful because it strikes me that for all of this being a kind of French colonial project, let's build some libraries and support them, it's also a project which shows an enormous amount of Vietnamese engagement with these institutions, right? I'm struck by the speed with which Vietnamese, at least in your telling of it, seem to have embraced the concept of a public library, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's not really a precedent for this, right? I mean, there had been sort of very restricted access to kind of, royal collections or whatever, but you had to be invited to use those. The idea of a kind of open space was relatively limited, generally speaking, restrictions as to who has access in terms of age and, sort of association or whatever. Striking how people sort of flood into these reading room spaces, and really kind of populate them and make it a space for themselves, right? Which, the French colonial librarians have certain expectations of what behavior should be on display there. But the Vietnamese seem to make this a space for themselves. And so, it's striking because there's a kind of a level of agency and a kind of response to the colonial opportunity, which does not remain controlled by the French colonial library heads, right? And they may restrict the collection, they may control the hours or whatever, but the Vietnamese make this a space for themselves, right? And it's really quite striking to see that manifested in this particular way, right? So it's a kind of an interesting engagement with the colonial encounter, which is not sort of in the realm of anti-colonial sort of armed resistance or whatever. It's a kind of new way of like making ourselves in a certain way, and not merely in response to the French expectations, but we're going to kind of take this space and we're going to read what we want and we're going to take away from it what we want.
Yeah, and I think the one of the core emergence from this project and framing it this way and speaking across the three fields is to push through processes of hybridity and cosmopolitanism that occur within these spaces, but then also like following it through by either tracing specific Vietnamese librarians who worked in the Francophone library, and they're like, no, we want to build a new library, and take that knowledge and that kind of technical bureaucratic work experience and create alternative libraries and to engage in vernacular. So Vietnamese book in the publishing series to propose that. The specific person I'm talking about is Nguyen Viet who proposed a vernacular library. But besides like the kind of more intellectual movements around building public libraries drawn off questions of the commons, like that was really something that I was struck by as well in terms of by decentering notions of publicity, that I mean the construct of the public library from the Hanoi Saigon case were not only about it being funded through quote public funds or state funds, but also that it was supposed to be widely accessible. So as George was saying, like that is unprecedented in longer Vietnamese literary and intellectual practices, like in the pre-colonial period. Yet, I think what was kind of really interesting about kind of the shift in thinking about publicity is that all these debates and kind of the learning curve that came with it and the pushing against it was really enlightening, because all these debates that emerged in Vietnamese press in the 20s and 30s that were occurring was like discussions about like proper behavior, right? Like what constituted the idealized quote modern public behavior in these shared spaces. And then there were all these debates like, maybe you shouldn't take a book, you should return it, maybe you shouldn't tear it and keep it for yourself, and those being kind of selfish or self-centered. And really kind of trying to push at and follow the debates around the commons and the public. And it, I mean, this is kind of the more background with that debate too, is that it was a struggle to land on the notion of public, because in Vietnamese the word public has, it doesn't translate in the same way. So I was settling on other notions of public that were more expansive, bringing in community libraries, Bin Dân, which is the commoner, the everyday person, and then to the part that George was writing about, or reading about, is well, if we're going to expand the public to be beyond elite intellectuals, this is the rural community, women, children. So like really that being not a self-defined, obvious fact, but being one in constant emergence and challenge. And that was a long process of, I think we're still engaging with that today, right? Who is the public and whose voice matters and who should guide other individuals? Like there's that debate still today in Vietnam and in the American context as well. Claire, you had something?
Yeah, I have a question. So you ended your comments with this really provocative question about like who's the library intended for? And so I kind of wanted to turn it around on you actually a little bit and ask like who your book is intended for. Because you spend so much time talking about reading and readers, and so I was just curious about like how you anticipated your reader reading your book. And just like go through kind of like your writing process a little bit of like, how does that engagement with reading actually shape your writing about readers? Yeah.
I think just two things. First, I had the privilege of having two real readers through the entire writing process. One was my mom. So she read excerpts of it and helped me with some like debate translations about like the Dutton and stuff like that. And my other reader, who's probably taking care of the kids, but is Eric, who copy edited and read all of it. So there was like an intention around accessibility and the reading flow. And I know I've heard from some of my friends who have read it that it's a bit dense as an academic book, but I still tried in terms of making it accessible for different ways. And I guess this is a long aside too. I created a bunch of paratextual materials, one being the zine with my co-designer Katie here, who created the zine. I created a reader guide because they're like the alternative to AI cliff notes about what the chapters are about. My book website, it's called Bibliotactics.com. It has like links to syllabi of how you could teach with it, other types of resources and video recordings. So I'm talking kind of like from the end stages and not reverse backwards, but at the end stage, I want this book to be read, but not necessarily like read in this form. Like if you see the cover, remember the title and remember this event, skim this, I'm like, wow, you really engaged my book in such a profound way. And that for me is just as important as, I'm sorry, your very deep engagement and comments from a scholarly view, but I think really, as I was coming to the final stages and the fact that I was like, I really wanted this to be open access and with my readers in Southeast Asia as well who could access material, we were thinking about translations as well. And I want this book to be read and to push people to kind of de-elitify what it means to read. Right, sorry, I made up a word, but it's just like this, to take away that we can engage with reading and reading cultures in non-hierarchical, non-linear ways, and offering an alternative to that. So all the paratextual stuff, and even my invitation that no, it's all right, you don't have to read the whole book. It's okay. But that you're here, you're engaging, and that in itself is such a gift to engage in that way. And then kind of the more intellectual, I guess, like reflections in terms of the design of the book, I wanted the book to be about practices. So while I do trace an institution, the fact that I'm tracing practices detemporalizes it and allows it to create this ability for a reader to relate. Right? Like I am in public sometimes, like that chapter 2, like what is it, how do I feel in these spaces, and what are the different types of kind of like affective experiences in being in certain types of spaces. And then to reassemble, I thought a lot about processes of collective identity and what that meant also like for the Vietnamese refugees and diaspora to be reassembling cultural heritage in different contexts in the diaspora, but also those that are still continuing that type of work in Vietnam itself. Yeah, so the focus on these practices then draw, at least what I envision the reader to be, is to make the book more relatable. And then the deep historical engagement is that this is, like, I actually like see history writing as such a privilege to be able to slowly transport oneself into understanding deeply another time and place. So I am proud to be an historian in that sense, to be able to invite those that maybe don't come from a historical discipline to also transport oneself into a different time and place, and all kind of the tedium that comes with the meticulous details of but that's how one understands, right? Is that like that, to understand all those details and that context, and through understanding we open our mindset. So I truly like wanted to weave together something that was accessible to ground history and narrative making, and actually the poetics of what it means to write history into the form of the book.
Thank you so much, Cindy. I really appreciate how you are thinking about different kinds of readers and really opening up different readerly publics within your book. So now we just want to open it up to our audience Q&A. We have about 10 minutes before we will move to the reception part of our event, but Cindy will go ahead and moderate and call on folks for this section.